Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Body, Soul, and Spirit podcast. I'm so glad you're joining us from wherever you are listening. We love our listeners, and we are really believing that you are going to be healthy, body, soul, and spirit. That is our desire. We've been talking about vulnerability, and if you were with us on our last podcast, we talked about vulnerability and the power of being vulnerable. Oftentimes, that's kind of a scary word for many of us. We don't like to feel vulnerable. But the problem when we are not vulnerable is if we are not vulnerable, we're actually shutting down emotionally. And anytime we shut down emotionally, we can say we're stuffing our emotions. It's stifling our growth. That's when we stop learning. Whenever we protect ourselves and we don't like feeling vulnerable, we actually are entering into a state where we emotionally stop growing. Emotionally, think about that word, emotionally. You're no longer growing emotionally. You could be growing in stature. You could be getting older in age, but emotionally, you're no longer growing because you have now protected yourself. And that protection of self is actually not allowing you to develop and grow in an emotional state of being. So emotional learning is important because to emotionally learn is going to give you the capacity to grow, mature, and continue to learn. And we also defined what vulnerability is. I know a lot of people had questions, and I'm going to answer some of those questions. Vulnerability comes from the Latin word vulere, and it means to wound. It means our capacity to be wounded. And oftentimes, that's a scary thing for all of us. There's a fear that could grip us because who wants to be wounded? Nobody does. But when we don't have that kind of capacity, in other words, we're scared to be wounded. We're afraid to be rejected. We're afraid of others hurting us. We're afraid of feeling pain by a relationship. Then we are no longer vulnerable. And the lack of vulnerability is causing you to stop growing emotionally. So vulnerability is necessary. It is the capacity for you to be wounded, meaning if somebody does reject me, if somebody does hurt me, I have the capacity for it. What do you mean? Well, I am probably I'm not at a place because I'm growing up emotionally. I'm not at a place where I maybe take it so personal. Maybe the other person is going through something and I don't take it so personal. So do you see how emotional learning is very necessary? And oftentimes we take everything so personal, and perhaps it's because we're not growing. We're not learning emotionally. So to learn emotionally and to grow emotionally is crucial. It is vital. And in order for us to grow emotionally and mature emotionally, it's going to require us not to shut down. It's going to require us to be vulnerable at times. Vulnerability doesn't mean that you are going to disclose all of your naked self to everybody. Vulnerability doesn't mean that you're going to tell everybody everything about you. That is not vulnerability. Vulnerability is the capacity to be wounded, meaning I can be myself. I don't have to stuff. I don't have to pretend. I can be my authentic self. Now, nothing in your life, no area in our lives, in our spirit, man. As a matter of fact, even spiritually, you can't grow unless you're vulnerable. God cannot do with us what he wants to do when we're not allowing ourselves to be vulnerable. I've seen it so often where people become stiff. They are hard. They put a wall up even before God. And they don't allow themselves to be vulnerable because they're scared. So that fear is preventing people from really growing. And that what has happened is that fear, that wall that was raised up for whatever reason, maybe because of a past trauma, a wound that happened, you stop growing. You let the fear come in and you stopped growing. So we talked about vulnerability, and some people have asked me the question, how can I be vulnerable to people that have hurt me? And so again, I say vulnerability is not that you're going to just disclose and open your heart up to everybody. You are still in a state where you are not necessarily opening your heart up to everybody. We understand that there are people that you're close to, and then there's others that you're not that close to. Vulnerability is just the capacity to be wounded. In other words, I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid if somebody rejects me. I'm not afraid if somebody, hurts me, maybe by words that they speak. I have the capacity for it. In other words, I can heal. I can heal forward. I can learn something about myself, even in that trauma or in that pain or in that rejection. I can actually learn something about myself. I'm not afraid of it. I'm not afraid to be wounded. Now, nobody likes to be wounded, but there are things that we can learn from it too. Let me give you an example. If somebody rejects you, you can learn something about yourself there. You can learn things like, why do I care so much about what others think of me? That's something I've asked myself. Why do I care? Maybe I need to grow there. Maybe I've stuffed something there. Maybe I am not allowing myself to grow emotionally in that particular area. And so I think the reason why we are not vulnerable, if I may be honest with many of you and my listeners, I think one of the main reasons why we're not vulnerable is self-protection. We protect ourselves. We are always in self-protection mode. What are people going to think of me? What is a person going to do to me if I don't protect myself? I've got to protect myself. And for a long time, maybe many of my listeners have been in self-protection mode. You've been protecting yourself for many, many years because maybe a parent didn't protect you. A parent didn't do what they were supposed to do. So now you have been in self-protection mode forever, and it has prevented you from being vulnerable. But I want to encourage you to let the guard down a little, because that is not going to let you grow emotionally. We must grow emotionally. We must learn our emotions. We must learn a lot of things about ourselves emotionally and then grow. We can't be fearful all our lives. We cannot let fear be the forefront of how we respond and react to every situation or to situations that maybe are alarming to us, like rejection. We feel rejection coming in, and now fear starts to rise. And what happens? We start to go into self-protection mode, and we don't allow ourselves to be that vulnerable, give ourselves that capacity to be wounded, right? So we self-protect. Nobody's going to do this to me ever again. And we self-protect. And what we're doing is we're not really learning many things about our emotional state. We're not really growing there. We're stifling things in our lives. We're stifling our own growth. Maybe that's the reason why you've carried fear for so long, because you stifled your own growth. I want to encourage every listener. Vulnerability is not bad. Vulnerability is allowing yourselves to be you, authentic you, without self-protection mode all the time. Because that is going to move you and you're going to gain really the benefit of it. Let's say somebody hurts you or somebody rejects you. Well, who's going to get the benefit out of it? You are. You are going to get the benefit out of it, because if somebody rejects you and they don't like you, well, it's their loss, because you're a really cool person to be with. You're a really cool person to spend time with, right? So who lost? They did. And then who's going to gain? You are, because at the end of it, you're going to learn something about yourself. Always come out with profit. Learn something from it. Grow emotionally. Why do I do that? I shouldn't respond like that anymore. And then move forward. You don't want to get stuck in these emotions for the rest of your life. You want to grow up in your emotions, right? You want to think different and respond in a different way. It's all about maturity, truly. And then for those of you that are my listeners and you have a relationship with God, know this, that God heals the heart. So if anybody wounded you, He is there to lift you up and to heal your heart. Now, another way that we self-protect, right, is, and this is one that we're going to continue on in our next podcast, so you got to stay tuned, because another way we self-protect is through detachment. We detach ourselves. I see this all the time, and I have to help people because people detach themselves. I see the self-protection, but then I also see the detachment. And detachment, it's detachment from other relationships that maybe threaten you, an authority figure. And all that is self-protection. And that's not helping us. That is not healing us. That is not moving us further away from the trauma. That is not moving us towards an authentic self. That is not moving us towards healing. Self-protection is not going to move you towards creativity. It is not going to move you towards a healthy brain. It is actually hindering your brain. We are in fight or flight mode all the time when you are in self-protection mode. So we must be people that want to get healed. I can't stress to you enough. These are times to get healed. If you carry that trauma, you carry that wound with you forever. It is not moving you towards a healthy you, an authentic you, and somebody who can be vulnerable. And you're better vulnerable. You're more likable vulnerable. And I know that's sometimes hard to swallow. And I know we can do it one step at a time together. So I want to encourage everybody, if you see yourself self-protection mode, or if anything that I said today kind of triggered you, and I hit a spot, I hit a button, I hit a soft spot in your life, go down that journey this week. Start asking questions. Why do I self-protect? What about me doesn't allow myself to ever be wounded? And I don't want to ever be wounded. Nobody's ever going to hurt me again. Nobody's ever going to treat me that way again. Think about that. Is self-protection something that is in your life that is preventing you from being vulnerable? And where did it come from? Where did it stem from? Was it a childhood trauma? Was it the abandonment from a parent? Was it maybe past relationships that have hurt you, that betrayed you, that offended you? And now you said, I will never allow. And so now you're in that mode. Please, let's do it one step at a time and start to bring down those walls. And what will you discover about yourself? Where am I leading you to? To emotional growth. Because when you are not vulnerable, it stifles growth in every area. When you're not vulnerable, even in God, it stifles your growth in God. When you're not vulnerable in your relationships with others that are healthy relationships, obviously, it stifles your growth. If you're not vulnerable in the marriage, it's going to stifle the growth of the marriage. If you're not vulnerable with your friends, it's going to stifle the growth of those relationships, even with yourself. If you're, I'm fine, everything's good. No, I'm fine. And you tell yourself that, and you've made yourself believe that you're fine, and you're not even vulnerable with yourself, you are not even going to grow in relationship with yourself. So let's take it one step at a time, and let's learn how to be vulnerable.